Hello, everyone. My name is Amadeu Ribeiro. I am a partner at the LA Piper. I chair the Investing in Brazil Committee at the Brazilian American Chamber in New York. I'm also responsible for our podcast series. And in today's episode, we have Kellie Meiman Hock, Senior Counselor at McLarty Associates. Kellie has a wealth of experience in the US-Brazil trade relations, and that is the topic of today's episode. Given the fast pace of things and how things are changing in today's relations between Brazil and the US, I should say that we are recording this on October 29th. So to begin, Kellie, welcome. And I wanted to ask you to give us a brief introduction on your professional background and tell us what you do today.
Thank you so much, Amadeo. Thanks to both you and to Will for the invitation. It's a real honor to be here with BrazilCham today as a former board member in particular. So my journey is I was a US diplomat for 9 years. I served during that time in Colombia, Porto Alegre, Brazil, Sao Paulo, Brazil, Recife, Brazil, and then my last posting was at the Office of the US Trade Representative, where I was director for Brazil in the Southern Cone. So always interacting quite a bit with various interlocutors in Brazil, including Intermarché on the trade relationship. And then for the last 25 years, I've been affiliated with McLarty Associates. I founded our Brazil Southern Cone practice and trade practice. And now I'm senior counsel of the firm and dabbling in some other things. But pleasure to be here with you today.
Thank you. I'm hard pressed to think of anyone else who's better positioned to give us the perspective on the current state of the US-Brazil trade relationship. And let's start with the elephant in the room. Can you paint a picture of where we have been over the past 6 months and so where you think we might be headed?
Yeah, it is an elephant in the room, but I'll say the elephant is looking better. I'll put it that way. But I think in recent, literally days, we've seen the situation trend favorably with the meeting over the weekend between President Lula and President Trump, by all accounts, going in a positive fashion. But before we jump into where we are, I think it might be helpful to jump into where we've been, because this really has been an incredibly dynamic time, especially the last 4 months or so. But obviously under President Trump, we've seen an extreme focus on trade policy, but in most particular on tariffs, right? Using tariffs as leverage for a variety of different items and issues, and deploying parts of US law that haven't been used in some cases ever to apply tariffs. And that is the case of, you've probably heard of IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. It's a law from 1977. It's been used a lot for sanctions, but it's never been used before for tariffs. And so if anyone remembers Liberation Day back on April 2nd, there was an announcement by the Trump administration, by the president himself personally, stating various tariff rates for various countries. And ostensibly, they were called reciprocity tariffs, right? So as a longtime trade negotiator dealing with Brazil, I heard reciprocity and I thought, oh man, Brazil's going to get hit because that's always been an issue between the US and Brazil bilaterally, is that there were certain items, ethanol is kind of the famous one, but certain items where Brazil had much higher tariff rates than the United States, and we'd be battling that out in various trade negotiating fora. So I was pleasantly surprised. I think a lot of Brazil watchers were pleasantly surprised, back on April 2nd, when Brazil was given the lowest possible rate of 10%. And so, and the reason being that the methodology ended up being not reciprocity, but it ended up being whether or not the United States had a trade surplus or a trade deficit with the country. And as I'm sure your listeners know, Amadeo, we've had for almost 20 years a trade surplus with Brazil. Modest, we've been a little bit, up and down on the level, but generally a trade surplus, which is a huge goal of the Trump administration. They're very focused on trade surpluses and deficits. So that, kind of made sense, right? And the Brazilians, very much appropriately reached out in May to try to even, negotiate what they could in the context of the 10%. But that being the case, they were at a lower rate. There were lots of fish to fry. They didn't hear back. So we were all really surprised on July 9th when through Truth Social, the Brazilian government received a letter from President Trump saying that there would be higher tariff rates put on. That was subsequently locked in through a federal register, or excuse me, not a federal register, through a executive order on July 30th. And so that's where, if you hear people kind of shorthanding and saying, oh, the 50% tariffs on Brazil, what it really means is that original 10% that I talked about from April 2nd, and then added onto it the tariffs that were announced in that executive order on July 30th, which was an additional 40%. And the justification for that legally was still IEEPA. It was still this emergency part of US law. Various justifications for that, some linked to the legal proceedings around former President Bolsonaro, some linked to digital policies around freedom of speech and political speech in particular. And so that put an additional 40% on Brazilian exports to the United States. So that's a lot. If you put that in context, that means that Brazil's paying higher tariffs than China on most goods, right? And so given that most of us, here in Washington, where I sit, this is a town where Republicans and Democrats can't agree what to have to eat for lunch, right? I mean, no one can agree on anything. And the one thing that people can agree on is that China is a threat and China is a concern, and we need to be addressing China. So to have Brazil facing a more prejudicial tariff environment than China, for many of us was a bit of a head scratcher. And so what we saw was, a real effort to try to negotiate some carve-outs, right? Negotiate some exceptions. And I think that that is particularly important when you look at our bilateral trade. About 1/3 of it, this is according to AmCham, Sao Paulo statistics, about 1/3 of it is intra-company trade. So it's that orange juice processor sitting in Florida that is importing frozen concentrated orange juice to be able to process it in their plant. So what that means, Amadeu, is a real level of interdependence. And that means that if you're tariffing Brazilian imports at 50%, you're going to be, in many cases, harming, depending on the sector, US production. So that led to, I think, some really interesting discussions on, where should we be applying these tariffs, where shouldn't we? And I've got a little cheat sheet because I can never remember the numbers myself, but at this point, we have only about 35% of Brazilian tariffs facing that 50% rate, because we have seen in certain sectors, orange juice, what I mentioned before, is one of them, aerospace, think of Embraer, but there's others where we've seen these carve-outs and various levels of tariffing beyond that. There's about 25% of Brazilian exports, believe it or not, in this environment aren't facing any tariff, right? So I think for those of your members that are doing business in the bilateral relationship, it's important to go beyond the headlines. And hopefully I'm not putting people to sleep walking them through this timeline, but I really think it's important for companies to be aware of the details, because the devil is in the details. But gosh, 25% of Brazilian exports not facing any tariffs. Maybe sometimes the angel is in the details too, right? Because that's a pretty good situation. Let's not talk about it too much, right? And don't let anybody notice. And so it's a varying rate of Brazilian exports, or a varying number that are facing these different rates. And in the backdrop, kind of like hanging out over our shoulders, is what we call a 301 investigation. So this is a different part of US law. IEEPA, those emergency tariffs, is one part. Section 301 is another part. And this is a section of a law from 1972 that allows us, 1974, that allows the US government to do investigations when they're alleging that a country is being prejudicial toward US interests. And so if you remember the Trump 1.0 China tariff, that was a 301 investigation, right? And so this is a 301 investigation that was filed against Brazil. And so that's kind of looming in the background, Amadeo. And when it was filed, I kind of went down a rabbit hole because it was so broad. I don't know if any of your listeners have read the scope of this investigation that's ongoing right now at USTR, but it's digital trade. It's those tariff peaks I talked about before. It's anti-corruption. It's intellectual property rights protection, IPR. It's those ethanol tariffs that we would always talk about when I was at USTR. It's deforestation. So it's the aperture on it is even broader than that China 301 that was done before. So that's also looming in the background. So just so many moving parts. And so what you're seeing is different tracks, right? So you've got the government to government track, which thank goodness is happening now because the governments weren't talking for a while. A lot of work went into that. That meeting that took place this weekend, the phone calls that predated it. I think it's terrific that President Lula and President Trump are now talking, that they're setting up a process, they're setting up a meeting schedule. And so, well, obviously a lot of this, history and very recent history is incredibly dynamic and very challenging for companies that obviously are seeking certainty in the rules of the road. At least we're at a place where the trend line, I think we can say in comparison to where we were a couple months ago, is positive.
Hey, Kellie, it's great to have you here with us. I think as I'm listening to you, I'm wondering, you've been involved in dozens, if not hundreds of negotiations over your career. What's the level of interest of doing business with Brazil right now, given all these moving parts? And, at least from an equity perspective, Brazil has become a very small market for investors. So things have to be very simple for people to want to invest in the Brazilian equity market. And right now there is interest because of everything that is going on. From a trade perspective, what are you hearing from your clients, and are they even bothering to find out how to do business with Brazil, or are they just looking elsewhere?
Yeah, here's what I'll say. Companies in general, because of all of the, as I diplomatically say, policy dynamism that's going on right now, it's hard for companies to make big decisions anywhere right now. So I think there's a lot of biding your time. That has nothing to do with Brazil, right? And so that's just true globally right now, at least what I'm observing. I think, the flip side of that is that, if we are in an environment where the, regular order with respect to how you are organizing your supply chains is in question, what at least I'm really noticing is a trend towards regionalization, a trend towards looking at, where it is that they can access priority markets, in a different way, and in a way where in many cases they're closer to their customer because they can't count on, that, auto part being able to cross the border 3 times, right? Or more, right? And so that is where I think it's a little bit interesting for Brazil because it is in and of itself such a big market, right? So, is everything that's going on positive net? I think it's hard to call it positive, but I also think that it's important to look for the opportunities and see where there might be, some openings for, accessing global South markets, accessing, South American markets, using Brazil as a platform. Obviously, whenever you think about that, Brazil cost, some of the complications of doing business in Brazil just generally come into play. You've been doing this for your whole career. I don't need to tell you that. But something that I'll say that I've observed outside of Brazil, and it would be great to see Brazil in understanding that we have an election coming next year. So these things are always hard in an electoral context in any country. But there's that maxim, never waste a crisis. I think we've moved away from crisis and into engagement, at least for now. I'm knocking on wood as I say that in the bilateral trade relationship. But that said, this is a, it's a challenging moment, right? So, we are seeing some countries taking advantage of this moment to enact, reforms that they need to do anyway, right? To make their markets more attractive for investors. And, you can always blame, oh, well, we've got to do this because look at all this crazy stuff going on over here. And so I would personally, just having worked on a lot of these market access challenges in Brazil for a while, and just the complexity of the tax system, et cetera, it'd be great to see this policy environment be used a little bit as, fuel and motivation, at some point, even if it's not now, in that regard, it could create an opportunity for Brazil.
So can we talk about that, the opportunities for Brazil in this challenging environment? What do you see as, the top opportunities for Brazil? And is there something that U.S. investors are missing when they look at Brazil and are trying to understand how the current environment affects trade and investment in the country? Is there something happening where Brazil can seize opportunities and people should be paying more attention to that?
Yeah, I mean, one area that I have for a long time wished that we collaborated more with Brazil on is critical minerals, because that has always been a gap, frankly, for us here in the United States, and a place where we are overly dependent upon China. And even going back to the Biden administration, when they were putting forward the green energy incentives, you may recall that the way that the IRA was written by our Congress, in their infinite wisdom, is that you could only have access inputs for your battery factory, let's say, that came from a country with which we have a free trade agreement. And so this really put a very critical mineral rich market, being Brazil. But Argentina was in the same boat. The Europeans were in the same boat. I mean, it wasn't just a way to block out Brazil. It was just, frankly, sloppily made policy. And we really realized at that moment that we were leaving value on the table. I mean, I think a lot of us that are, have been in the trenches of this trade relationship for a while had known that for a while, but it did raise the visibility. And it's an area where very clearly the United States is underinvested. So if I had to pick an area where both, I think there's a lot of opportunity, and hearkening back to the trade discussions that are going on, I mean, the interlocutors are going to have to design a package that both sides can call successful, right? And where both sides can call it a win. And we have seen country after country go through this exercise, right? From the Japanese to the Europeans, and it just broke today that the Koreans are going to be announcing an agreement with the United States. And it strikes me, I mean, again, a lot of the elements in that 301 investigation are going to be in play. But I think also just the commercial issues that make sense for us to address are going to be really important. And I do think that I think critical minerals can be an important part of that.
Yeah, on that subject, obviously critical minerals has been a big part of the U.S.-China negotiation. Today is October 29th. I don't know what time this will be airing, but it's tonight, our time, tomorrow morning, their time. It's when President Xi and President Trump will be speaking and supposedly coming up with some type of framework for a deal. Mm-hmm. But how does the China relationship, because Brazil has always been a country that's been kind of in the middle, trading both with the U.S. and with China. Obviously, China has grown as a trading partner with Brazil over the years. So how does the China relationship play into this? And where do we come out as Brazil?
Yeah, that really is the right question, Will, because that is going to, I think, be one of the tougher sticking points, right? Is how do you manage that? Because there has been so much inbound Chinese investment. I mean, just setting the trade relationship aside for a second, there's been so much inbound investment by Chinese interests in Brazil. And a graph that I use a lot when I speak on this issue, which I don't know if it'll show on your screen, but I mean, this is Chinese investment in Latin America between 2003 and 2022. So it's a little bit dated, but still pretty accurate. All you need to know is the bottom line is Brazil.
That's amazing.
You think, because, and I also use this slide a lot. And this is, by the way, by Margaret Myers at the Inter-American Dialogue, where I'm on the board. So give Margaret a shout out, but because it's great data. the other place that I use it a lot is that you'll hear U.S. officials, getting wrapped up into pretzels because X, Y, or Z country has joined Belted Road, the Belt and Road Initiative of China. And guess who hasn't? Brazil, right? And look how much investment's gone in. And a lot of it, not all of it, she does break it down by sector. Not all of it's in critical minerals, but it's a lot of the, yes, it's a lot of extractive. It's a lot of infrastructure. It's a lot of the issues or sectors that are going to raise issues, right, with the U.S. government and therefore with U.S. companies that are thinking about accessing those items. And this trend line, I mean, this data went through 2022, but the the China-Brazil Business Council, I kind of flip onto their site every once in a while because they do outstanding data. And, they recently came out with a data set that showed that between 2023 and 2024, that Chinese FDI in Brazil is more than doubled. That's a lot, especially if you think of that line. That's already a big line, right? That's a lot of money. So, and in what, electricity, oils, autos, a lot of different sectors, right? So I think that kind of returning to what I said about the sensitivity of China in American politics, that is going to make it hard. And I think that one kind of space to watch that I think might be interesting for Brazil watchers who are worried about this question to watch is how the China question ends up being addressed in the USMCA review, TIMIC in Spanish. And that's ongoing. The formal kind of will we, won't we of the review, will we continue the agreement, will we modify it, isn't until next June. But the public hearing on it will be here in Washington on the 17th of November. The public comment period's already started in Canada, Mexico, and the United States. And everyone knows that this issue of not just, Chinese transshipment of goods, which is also an issue for Brazil as well, but also, this issue of Chinese capital being invested in Mexico in particular.
Yeah, because
right?
on that chart that you showed, I was surprised to see how Mexico was not very present there. I mean, Peru was the second one, I believe. But I bet you since 2022, Mexico has jumped up to being maybe not the same level as Brazil because you get things like BYD and folks like that investing like significant amounts of money into industrial plants in Brazil. But I bet you Mexico has become the #2 destination by far.
Yeah.
You don't think?
I don't know. I'm going to follow up with you on that, number one, because we need to answer that question. But here's the reason that I think Mexico, in contrast to Brazil, has historically been a bit more skeptical of inbound Chinese investment, and this is why. They view China as a competitor in a way that I think Brazil doesn't, right? Because the relative cost of labor, tax burden, it's so much. The Brazil cost does get in Brazil's way, right? As far as being a real head-to-head competitor with China in accessing markets in the Americas. Whereas Mexico's always kind of viewed, China, as China's rise has become more and more apparent as they're eating my lunch. Like, I'm going to be pretty careful. Now, is there a lot of Chinese inbound investment? There is, but I think particularly with the more sensitive sectors like autos, et cetera, the Mexicans overall have been pretty careful. And you've seen Claudia Sheinbaum came out just 3 weeks ago or so, with the proposal that they're going to put 50% tariffs on countries to inbound, imports into Mexico that they do not have trade agreements with. Okay. And so everyone's always trying to design a policy that gets at China without saying China. That's a little bit what this is about, to be fair. But they are revisiting this and engaging in bilateral discussions, actually in kind of a Trumpian way, right? You announce a tariff and then you get into these hub and spoke negotiations. And that's really what the Mexicans are endeavoring to do right now, including because they're finding, much as we're finding in the United States, that if you capture that swath of goods at a 50% rate, a great number of those goods are going to be inputs to Mexican production, factories, car parts. Think of a Korean automaker, right? A lot of their parts were coming from Korea. They don't have an FTA with Korea, right? So So that's kind of a journey that the Mexicans are going down in trying to balance. Yes, we want this investment, but to what extent are we undercutting our own industries? And so, so yes, it's increased, but you know, they're just in such a different competitive environment with China versus Brazil, and they don't have the soybeans thing, you know.
Right.
Very interesting. So I wanted to go back to the opportunities that Brazil has, and you mentioned critical minerals, infrastructure, but then you also mentioned the Brazil cost. And what kind of a role does the so-called Brazil cost play into this? And to what extent will that prevent Brazil from seizing these opportunities, especially in critical minerals, where it is one thing to own the minerals, it's another thing to turn that into a product and get it out to the world?
Yeah, the processing, we're all vulnerable, right? Because the Chinese have so much of the processing concentrated there. But yes, I mean, Brazil cost is absolutely critically important. I think that to the extent that this high tariff environment that the United States has engendered is sticky, and I do think it will be relatively sticky. It's going to be hard to get rid of a lot of these tariffs. And while countries have to date been shy in retaliating against the United States, China is the only country that's retaliated against the United States in a very effective, very broad-based way. Canada did in a bit more constrained way, but I don't know that that's going to remain the case in the medium to long term, depending on how this story evolves. Long way to say that if other countries' costs are increased, by high tariffs, does that end up, kind of leveling the playing field, if I can put it that way, a little bit with the higher cost of doing business in Brazil, perhaps, but I would hope that Brazil would continue, right? It's just hard. If it were easy, it would have been done already. That Brazil would continue to try to address, some of the challenges of doing business in Brazil. Again, kind of taking this moment as an opportunity to do so.
Kellie, you mentioned the negotiation with Mexico and the USA and Canada, USMCA. Does Mercosur matter? Does China even consider that as a trading partner? Does that play a role in any way in these discussions as well, or
Does the U.S.
or other agreements?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting moment for Mercosur to think about, what other trade agreements they can close, again, taking advantage of the moment, that would allow them to be a more attractive market because they would have more export opportunities. And you saw Mercosur just recently close on the EFTA agreement, the kind of non-EU European countries, which had been kind of, tripping along for a while. It finally got closed. It's being reported this week that the Europeans are planning on having their member state vote on the EU Mercosur free trade agreement, which has been, I mean, we were looking at that when I was still at USTR, and I left USTR 25 years ago, right? So it's been a minute that agreement's been floating around, and I would often joke that it might get ratified for my grandchildren to put a factory in Brazil and send into Europe, but they're saying now that they're in mid-December going to do the member state votes so that they can up or down ratify it. And that von der Leyen is planning on going to Brasilia on December 20th. So gosh, we might get a Christmas present, because that would open up huge numbers of, new consumers for Brazilian production to sell into. So that's kind of interesting. And I think we're seeing across the board, Brazil and Argentina and Paraguay and Uruguay, to be clear, because I think that this moment has a lot of countries and trading blocs like Mercosur thinking about how can I diversify my supply chains? How can I diversify who I'm selling to? Have I been over reliant on the United States? Is this a vulnerability for me? And it's a valid question to ask right now, given our politics here in Washington. So, I think that that's a positive. I mean, I know, back in the day, I was helping to put a factory in Brazil for a Canadian manufacturer, and we were pushing, like, please do a free trade agreement. And it was just one of those, nobody really prioritized it, so it never happened. Now they're talking again. So I think there's opportunities like that. But as far as the US, I will say President Trump is not a fan of customs unions. I mean, he doesn't even like that he has to deal with Brussels and can't just go and deal with the Germans and then deal with the French, et cetera. And he feels the same way about Mercosur, right? I mean, and you see this in the differentiated treatment between Brazil and Argentina. He has a very close relationship with Milei, et cetera. And so I think that as far as the US, Mercosur, US, Brazil, US, Argentina, we're going to continue to see that dynamic, be the state of play.
So you would say that in the region, in Latin America, bilateral agreements, as we're seeing elsewhere in the world, are going to be prevalent in the future?
Well, I mean, to be clear, what we're seeing elsewhere in the world are deals. I wouldn't even really call them agreements. They're more deals to address the Liberation Day tariffs, right, that were placed on various countries. And beyond the Liberation Day tariffs, also the 232 tariffs, which we haven't even talked about. It's a vegetable soup of trade law that we're engaging in. But this is Section 232 is a part of U.S. trade law that is administered by the Department of Commerce, and it allows you to do a process to do a national security investigation of the import of a certain good. So think about, we talked about 301 investigations before. Those are of countries. 232 investigations are with respect to a good. So you're saying that the import of a certain good is threatening US national security, and therefore we should be able to take action, a tariff, et cetera. And so if you've heard about the steel and aluminum tariff, the legal authority for that does come from Section 232 from the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. Last time around during Trump 1.0, we saw countries get, side deals that made these 232 tariffs less prejudicial. Maybe a tariff rate quota, so you pay a tariff only up to a certain amount and then you pay a higher amount after that, that sort of deal. In this case, what we are seeing, again, in a very unprecedented way, is very broad application of Section 232. And I have, again, you don't need to read it, but this is the list of 232s that are ongoing right now. Steel and aluminum, autos, copper, some are already in place, lumber, but we've never in the history of the statute had this many cases going on. This is a huge swath of the US economy, including some goods that are important to Brazil, including those critical minerals we were talking about before. There's a 232 investigation of them. And what makes this kind of tougher for companies to track and to have any certainty around, even though, to be clear, this process is it's transparent, there's a timeline, there's public comment periods. It's not like IEEPA where you apply a tariff and it's on the next day, or it's even not, on almost immediately. In this case, there is a procedure, but they are defining, because under the statute, you can apply the tariff on a good and derivatives. And so they're defining derivatives in a very, very broad way. There are over 700 products that have been defined as derivative to steel and aluminum. So think of anything in your house that has steel and aluminum on it. So your refrigerator, your washing machine, most of those have been named as derivatives, but then it even gets a little goofy. Whipped cream is derivative. They can. Yeah. They can. Yeah. And the Wall Street Journal had an op-ed a few weeks ago, actually written by a friend of mine, that made the point, if you're calling a dairy product metal, you might have a problem, because and the problem is for companies, how do you plan around that, right? I mean, you're in business, you just want certainty. And so a lot is being said about the Supreme Court hearing the IEEPA case, whether or not IEEPA is a valid use, that applying tariffs through IEEPA, I should say, is a valid use of the statute. It's going to be heard by the Supreme Court of the United States on November 5th. So maybe even when this drops, so maybe we'll know, what they decide. But, and a lot of folks are properly focused on that, right? But I guess, I would say, as far as how a country like Brazil needs to think about its standing and in the talks that they're engaged in with the US government. There's all the issues that are on the table that we already talked about in the 301. There's all the issues that have been put on the table with the IEEPA tariffs. But then I would think of a third bucket, which is really these 232 tariffs, which do include a number of products and exports from Brazil to the United States that are quite important to the country and that can have an impact as well on your export profile. So all of those deals that are being addressed, kind of to get back to your question, Amadeu, I went down a 232 rabbit hole there for a second, but it's important because they're talking, the deals that they're trying to come to are to deal with those IEEPA tariffs, to try to get, in some cases, a lowering of rates, or at least a locking in of a certain rate that was already announced. But they're at least endeavoring to try to address these 232 tariffs as well. And then you've seen, purchasing agreements and investment commitments and other issues and items become part of those discussions as well.
Kellie, you've been super generous with your time. It's maybe as a closing remark, given the fluid times we're living in, the uncertainties that we're dealing with, and the fact that you have clients who are looking to do either start business in Brazil or expand their business in Brazil, what are some pieces of advice that you would give our U.S. members as to what they should be focusing on if they're looking to do one of those things?
Yeah, I would harken back to some of the comments that I've made earlier in the podcast with respect to looking at regional trade flows, looking at where there might be new export opportunities using Brazil or Mercosur as a base that you hadn't thought of before. Not rolling your eyes at the EU-Mercosur agreement like I used to do, for example. And also just given that this is such a dynamic time, and I guess as a consultant, this will sound self-interested, but you really need help. At this time, you just do, local expertise, local knowledge. Frankly, with respect to both, if you're a U.S. company, both the United States and Brazil, because it's kind of coming at you both ways as far as uncertainty for various reasons. And just one issue that I feel like I need to raise, because that we haven't talked about it at all. We've been more focused on goods versus services, but to not forget how digital the Brazil environment is, and digital trade is one of the key issues that's being addressed in the 301 investigation, and it's been an issue of challenge, we can say, in the bilateral trade relationship. So being sure, and so much in Brazil is digitally enabled, and every company is a digital company everywhere now, but I would say especially in a market of early adopters like Brazil is. So thinking through that angle and being sure that you understand the ramifications of some of the regulatory changes that are going on right now, I think would be super important.
Kellie Meiman Hock, pleasure to have you on. This was wonderful. Thank you.
It was a lot of fun.
Kellie.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.